To test and replace your catalytic converter, you'll need a 3/8" drive socket set, a set of flat wrenches, some penetrating oil, a rubber mallet, a wire brush, a block of wood, safety glasses, a pair of gloves, a jack and a set of jack stands, a small screwdriver, a propane torch, a vacuum gauge, the correct catalytic converter, and the correct size U-bolts for your vehicle. If your vehicle has an air tube attached to the catalytic converter, you will also need an air tube repair kit. Before you test or replace your catalytic converter, start with a cool engine, preferably after the vehicle has not been driven for 12 hours, as catalytic converters get very hot during vehicle operation and they maintain heat for a long while afterwards. First, check for excessive restriction in the exhaust system. Attach a vacuum gauge to a fitting or port that has full engine vacuum, such as directly from the intake manifold or a port tapped in below the throttle plates. Start the engine and observe the reading on the gauge. A normal reading for most vehicles at idle is about 17 to 19 inches of vacuum. Now raise the engine speed to over 2,500 RPMs and hold it steady. The difference in the at idle reading and the at 2,500 RPMs should not differ more than 3 inches of vacuum. An exhaust restriction, such as a plugged converter, will cause a significantly lower reading. Next, you'll need to raise the vehicle and put it on jack stands. This will enable you to work under the vehicle safely. Never work under a vehicle with only the jack for support. To ease viewing in our example, we have placed the vehicle on a hoist. Wear safety glasses whenever working under a vehicle. Now locate the catalytic converter. It will normally be found between the exhaust pipe and the muffler. Examine the converter for physical damage. Tap on it with a rubber mallet and listen for any loose pieces inside of it. If the insides of the converter have broken loose, it must be replaced. To determine if the converter is the cause of the exhaust restriction, drill an 1/8" hole in the pipe a couple of inches before the converter. With the engine running at idle, measure and record the exhaust gas pressure at the point of your drilled hole. If the exhaust system is free from restrictions, you will get a very low or no reading on the gauge. If your reading is above a half pound of pressure, continue this procedure. Now use a 1/8" aluminum rivet to plug the first hole. Then drill another 1/8" hole in the exhaust pipe after the converter. Once again, measure and record the exhaust back pressure at the second hole with the engine idling. If the difference between your first reading and the second reading exceeds 1/2 pound of pressure, the converter must be replaced. The first step in the replacement is to apply penetrating oil to the flange nuts and U-bolts and allow it to soak in. Also apply penetrating oil to the air tube nuts if so equipped. It is best to do this the night before to allow the oil to work in. Remove the flange nuts and bolts from the forward end of the catalytic converter. Remove the old flange gasket. The old gasket may stick to the flange, but can easily be pried off with a small screwdriver. Remove the U-bolt from the rear joint between the converter and the exhaust pipe. Use caution. U-bolts get very rusty and can break off suddenly. Always wear work gloves whenever handling exhaust parts. The catalytic converter will most likely be too rusted to the exhaust pipe to be tapped off with a mallet. To ease removal, heat the neck of the converter with a propane torch to expand it enough to twist the converter loose. Remember, the converter neck will be very hot. Once the converter has been removed, use a wire brush to clean the loose scale and rust from the outside of the exhaust pipe. Install the replacement converter onto the exhaust pipe. You may have to tap it into place with the rubber mallet. Use a block of wood between the converter and the mallet to prevent damage to the replacement converter. Install the new U-bolt over the converter neck at the rear U-joint, about a 1/2 inch from the end of the neck, but leave it loose for the moment so adjustments can be made as necessary to align the flange holes at the opposite end. Position the converter so the flange on it is aligned with the flange and the manifold pipe. Push the bolts all the way through both halves of the flange and install the nuts. Tighten the nuts firmly and evenly. Now tighten the U-bolt firmly in place. On some vehicles, you may also have to replace the air tube leading down to the converter if it is rusted or damaged during the installation. Start the engine and check for leaks. Return the vehicle to the ground, and you're done.
Now let's review the procedures for identifying a plugged catalytic converter. There are two common methods used. For the first method, attach a vacuum gauge to a manifold vacuum source. Observe your reading at idle. Commonly, you will find that reading to be between 17 and 19 inches of vacuum. Now raise and hold the engine speed at 2,500 RPM. If the vacuum reading drops more than 3 inches of vacuum, there is a restriction in the exhaust. The other test requires you to drill an 1/8-inch hole in the exhaust pipe in front of the converter. Insert the vacuum gauge and note the pressure reading. With the engine idling, a reading of a ½ pound or less indicates a properly operating exhaust. If the reading is above a ½ pound of pressure, plug the first hole with an 1/8-inch aluminum rivet and drill another hole in the exhaust pipe after the converter. Once again, tap into this hole with the pressure gauge and note the reading. If the difference between your first reading and the second reading is over a ½ pound of pressure, the catalytic converter is plugged. Remember, safety first. Make sure you are always wearing eye protection and work gloves when performing exhaust system repairs. Always use jack stands to support the vehicle when working underneath it. Always allow sufficient time for the catalytic converter to cool before performing repairs. This can often take several hours. To replace a catalytic converter, first remove the flange nuts or bolts from the front end. Remove the old flange gasket if so equipped. Remove the clamp or hanger bolts securing the rear side of the converter. Separate the exhaust pipe with a hammer and chisel or by sawing it with a hacksaw. Clean the loose scale and rust from the exhaust pipe with a wire brush. Install the replacement converter on the exhaust pipe. Align the flange holes, insert a new gasket, and install the front mounting bolts. On some vehicles, you may have to replace the air tube leading to the converter. Tighten all clamps and hangers, and you're done.